In other words, Christ is saying, get swords so that the prophecies about me can be fulfilled. And then what do the apostles say? They said, look, Lord, here are 2 swords. Is it conceivable to any of you that with 2 swords Jesus planned to overthrow the Roman Empire?
There were more.
That's what he was trying to suggest.
The war in Ukraine is fought in the name of Christianity. The Russians claim to be defending God. The Ukrainians claim to be defending God. The Americans claim to be arming the Ukrainians in defense of the God-driven imperative of their belief system. The British government bombed Iraq, Afghanistan and Libya in the name of God.
We're going to debate the question, should you follow communism or should you follow Christianity? I am going to make the case, ladies and gentlemen, that you should follow the Christian faith, and if you're a communist, you should abandon communism. My first reason for this is that the diagnosis, the description, the ontological description of humanity, can you just count me down how many minutes have passed?
4 minutes.
Yeah, right. The ontological description of communism.
Do you tell people what ontological
is? Ontological is about the nature of the being of the human person, is flawed and incorrect. Communism states that human beings are born a blank sheet of paper, and society writes the code upon your soul that you then go on to live by. So if you're greedy, it's because the society you're born into is greedy. And that if we create a communist state, that a new man will emerge, a Marxist man, a communist man, who will be free from the worst traits of humanity. This is a lie. Karl Marx was wrong. Human beings are, for the most part, a blank sheet of paper. But on that blank sheet of paper is a single line of code that you were born with from birth. You had it. It is to be selfish. Biologists like Richard Dawkins acknowledge the idea of the selfish gene. And we see in all kinds of human civilizations through all of society, including everywhere where communism has been tried, that selfishness corrupts those societies. Why has communism never been tried, as the good lady states? Why have the communists always failed to establish communism? Because of the selfishness of the people creating the society. Christianity, by comparison, is accurate in its ontological description of humanity. It says that human beings are born selfish, and it uses that truth to guide its politics, so that the point of political affairs is to mitigate the selfishness of man. The reason why capitalism is so successful in our world is precisely because it agrees with the selfishness of man. It gives license to the selfishness of man, and that is why as an economic system it works. Don't take my observation as an endorsement. It isn't. I don't endorse capitalism or laissez-faire economics. However, that is the reason why communism has consistently failed, and it is the reason why capitalism succeeds. Because capitalism acknowledges the selfishness of man and works with it. And thus this is a proof that the Christian teaching about the ontological nature of man is true. But by contrast, the ontological statements of the writings of communists like Karl Marx are in error. And if you're building your politics on error, they will fail, just as we have seen communist states fail across the world. How much time do I have, sorry?
Thank you very much, that was impressive. Even though I studied
4 minutes.
sociology for my sins once upon a time, I still never quite grasped what ontological is. So, do you want to repeat
I'm sorry,
that again?
I'm having a formal debate.
How you define that
Ontological is a description of human nature.
again? Of human nature. So, the argument that Bob was making is that man is inherently bad. I don't think that's actually what the Bible says, but I'm not a Christian and I haven't really studied the Bible. But as far as I know, that's not what the Bible's arguing. I think the Bible is arguing that man is inherently good, and that the behavior of human beings should be brought into alignment with that endemic goodness, that inherent goodness that God created within man, and that finds its negation in the breach of the regulations and rules and moral norms and cultural behavior instilled by the belief in God, Jesus and Christianity. That's how I understand Christianity. I could be wrong. Now, I'm not here to try and correct your Christianity, but that's just how I've understood it. I didn't realize it was about bad people being bad all the time, sinners, as some of the speakers at Speaker's Corner make out. Now, the argument that Bob made that man is bad and that that's why communism or Marxism is inevitably going to fail, I think is incorrect. Marx did not argue that human beings are inherently bad or inherently good. What he argued was that the conditions in which people live are governed by the processes that they need to carry out in order to survive. They have to work and produce things to satisfy the wants of existence.
2 minutes.
But human beings produce things that then gain, there is a piece in the Bible, I think it's Isaiah 8, it says, they worship that which they made with their fingers. In other words, man makes God and makes gods which they then worship. They produce God. They produce God. Feuerbach, one of Marx's inspirations, argued. They produce God in the spirit of the positive concepts of man. So in other words, God is an image of the most positive imagination and conceptual frameworks of what man should be. Now, Marx argued that you can actually only establish a community and a brotherhood of man, such as that envisaged by the followers of Jesus and the disciples of Jesus. You can only establish such a society based on material plenty. And there are examples in the Bible which illustrate that theoretical principle. For example, when Moses takes his people into the desert and they suffer, then they begin to worship false idols, exactly at a time when their material condition is so poor that they cannot survive. Jesus, in order to impress himself on the people, has to produce from 5 fish 5,000. In other words, the satisfaction of the wants of the people to allow them to create a morally good society is preconditioned on having a certain material foundation. And it's on that theoretical framework of the material foundation for plenty and for collaboration that Marx's theory of socialism and communism came about. He did not believe that you could create communism in any circumstances. He believed there had been a long period of primitive communism that could be restored. Communism could be restored when plenty was established.
Thank you very much, really good. So, ladies and gentlemen, the second critique as a Christian that I place against communism, on top of the ontological criticism, is the fact that it is based on a false sociology. Marx based his understanding of the process of the emergence of the communist state almost in fatalistic terms. And the reason why he did that is that he was using the Hegelian paradigm by the philosopher Hegel that spoke of the zeitgeist of the time in which society would progress from thesis to antithesis to synthesis, and that this material process would inevitably lead to the rise of the communist state. That Hegelian thesis of the natural progress of the zeitgeist has been proven false countless times. It is not clearly evidenced in history that the progress of societies is always to go forward. There are countless examples when societies have gone backwards. Let me give you an example. The collapse of the Roman Empire in the 4th century led to a decrease in learning, led to what Enlightenment thinkers termed as the Dark Ages. In other words, the thesis upon which Marx builds his whole paradigm of the Hegelian progress of material economy is not always true and is sometimes false. In other words, if Hegel was wrong, Karl Marx was wrong, and Hegel was wrong. Ladies and gentlemen, the reality is that Marx does make observations that I agree with. Economy does affect your lives. It affects the decisions you make. It affects the decisions that are available to you. But the problem with the Marxist critique of capitalism is that it believes that freedom can come about if the worker has possession of the means of production, that this itself gives freedom. But Christ says no to this. Christ says that freedom is a faculty, ladies and gentlemen, of knowledge. That if you know the truth, it is the truth that shall set you free. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, even if the proletariat were to gain control of the means of production, if they were not in the truth of Christ, they would still be bound to their sin. They would still be bound to their fallenness. They would still be bound to corruption that so permeates the world. The reality is that you have two roads for freedom promised to you, one by Christ, one by Marx. Marx says that it is through the possession of the means of production. Christ says that it is in the knowledge of the truth. These two theses cannot be reconciled. These two theses are quite different, and they cannot both be correct. Therefore, if Christ is right, Marx is wrong. If Marx is right, Christ is wrong. And just to show you, ladies and gentlemen, that my next go.
2-0 to Bob the Builder, 2-0. Haven't even said anything yet. Go on. Can't be two without me saying anything. Oh, my time's going. George Friedrich Wilhelm Hegel was referred to. Hegel was the official Prussian philosopher from 1815 to 1830. In his older years, he was a believer, and in fact throughout his life, he was a believer in Christianity. What he did was he tried to work out the strange and mysterious ways that God moves the earth. He believed that God would move through human beings through a series of contradictory processes which were observable in the world, would move towards the idea of God being realized on earth. Now there are people, speaking scorn up, who stand up as Christians and say, well, you must repent because in the afterlife you're going to go through hell. You know, you'll be tortured, murdered, burned, set on fire, so on. There are a lot of people who think that's an appealing concept as to why you should adopt Christianity. Now Hegel didn't believe that. Hegel believed that God was moving through man as a spirit to make human beings establish a superior type of human life on earth. It was again a reflection of the conflicts between the Catholic Church, which had ruled over Europe in an obscurantist and authoritarian fashion for centuries, between Charlemagne's time or even earlier, up until the 17th century. the French Revolution and the English Revolution. But earlier than this, a little bit earlier than this in Germany, Martin Luther adopted a new form of Christianity. You have to understand these processes of the development of Christianity, not in terms of a body of ideas, which was the problem with Hegel's concept. He believed it was simply the transformation of ideas, clashing and then advancing human behavior. So ideas make history rather than the real conditions of people. The consequence of that was there was a clash. When Martin Luther went to Rome and discovered that the Catholic Church was based on fraud and lies, pompous people in smart outfits, adorning themselves with ornaments and gold, and acquiring wealth at the expense of the masses, they were corrupt and should be overthrown. And therefore, when they found out that they were issuing indulgences, in other words, you could murder someone and get a piece of paper, a dispensation from God, that would excuse you from your actual actions on earth, your material activity on earth. Martin Luther rejected this. And the Anabaptists, who believed that Christianity was no longer something you should worship in a church, it's not to be found in a church. They said that the relationship between man and God, in other words, the relationship between man and their moral being, was about a direct relationship between the individual and God. And that's why they called themselves the Anabaptists, the born again. You were born when you're an adult to affirm your belief in a way of life. Now, these type of ideas were closely related to early communistic principles. For example, Thomas Müntzer, Martin Luther's ally, led a revolutionary struggle against the rulers in Europe in 1525 to establish a communistic community of the people. Many of the communities that established the United States as we know it today emerged from those type of communities. They do have a direct link to communistic principles.
So, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you're enjoying yourself. This is exactly what Speaker's Corner is meant to be about. However, let me correct the history that my esteemed colleague has just given to you. Because, ladies and gentlemen, he has provided with you an ahistorical reading of Christianity. He has tried to suggest that Christ was the first communist and that the first apostles envisioned a communist state, and that what the events of Munster were the establishment of a communistic kind of society. This is simply factually wrong. The reality is that the early Jewish Christian movement was an apocalyptic Jewish movement that believed that their Messiah had inaugurated a new age in which God's kingdom would advance upon earth. And that is exactly what I believe as a Christian. When the events of Munster occurred during the Reformation, it was not to establish anything like a communist society. He's factually wrong in saying that. What was being established in Munster was an apocalyptic theocracy. Does apocalyptic theocracy sound like communism to you? No, of course not. But go and read the writings of the people involved in that revolution. They saw their actions as being inauguration of the end of the age. The age that we live in, the age that we live in is the age of the church. And the mission of the church is to do something far better than the Communist Party, far better than ever envisioned by Marx. And that is to allow, through Christ, in his holy church, the advancement of the kingdom of God on earth. That, through the work of the church, society may be restored, that the human person may be restored, that nature may be restored to that which was envisioned by God in the garden, where man would live in unity with man and with nature and with God in peace and justice. And this is exactly, ladies and gentlemen, what the church is about. And if you're a Christian, if you're a Christian, don't feed the troll with energy. If you're a Christian, ladies and gentlemen, I want to say to you that you have a vision and a mission that is greater than the one laid out by Marx in the Communist Manifesto. The Communist Manifesto is an ideology built on envy and bitterness at the success of some over others. And out of that bitterness and envy is the desire for violence. Christians are concerned every bit as much as communists with justice. And we have pursued justice for 2,000 years. Sometimes we have succeeded, sometimes we have failed. Sometimes we have been let down by those who claim the name Christ but know nothing of his teachings. By contrast, the revolutionaries that killed the saints, Tsar Nicholas and his family, were driven by an ideology of hatred that led to violence, and that is why communism has resulted in the deaths of over 140 million people in 100 years. One of the most bloodiest ideologies in history.
The reason why I'm taking up the issues that are specifically raised is because Marxism is about a method of understanding the history of the world based on the material conditions that people live in. And so, for example, the image that Paul presents of Jesus Christ, I don't think is accurate. Jesus Christ, don't forget, lived under a society in which the Jewish people and the Christian people were enslaved. And people who are enslaved generally dislike their enslavement. Not always, but generally dislike their enslavement. And so there are interpretations which I think are correct as to what Jesus was up to, which contradict the type of argument that is being presented and contradict the general view of what Jesus is in the Christian ideology or Christian faith. Jesus, I put to you, was a revolutionary leader of the slaves of Judea. And the reason why he was executed, if you check through the text of the Bible, you'll see many of them have been changed at different times during the course of history. Particularly under the Romans, they changed them. When the Romans adopted Christianity, they removed part of what Jesus was supposed to have said. Because if you ask yourself, Jesus was going around, a few days before he was killed, Jesus was going all around making speeches, right? And then when, what's his name, the traitor? Judas. When Judas goes to report where Jesus is, that's supposedly what he gets paid for, right? Yes? He gets paid for revealing where Jesus is. But Jesus is going and speaking in public like I am at Speaker's Corner. Everybody knew where Jesus was. He wasn't betraying where Jesus was. On the contrary, what happened at the Last Supper indicates that Jesus was plotting an armed insurrection against Roman rule, against the rule of the slave owners. So what he said at the Last Supper was, I quote you, you can tell me the exact quotation, but you know what I mean. He says, if you have a mantle, a coat, sell it and get a sword. If you have some other thing, sell it and get a shield. And then he leads his forces up onto a hill or something like that. They meet the Romans, and I think it's Simon, if I'm right, pulls out his sword and smites off the ear of a Roman soldier. In other words, a direct clash organized by Jesus to organize an insurrection against the oppression of the oppressed, against the slave people. But under the Roman rule, when Romans adopted the belief of Christianity, after all, before that they used to feed them to the lions, right, in circuses. When they adopted Christianity, they needed to make it a passive and reformist religion. And so they changed the wording, they changed the emphasis, and they made the story
into something where Jesus was some kind of pacifist, where he says, you know, do not hurt the other person, do not harm the other person. 2 or 3 words after he's told people to get a sword and overthrow Roman rule. In other words, Jesus was, in my interpretation, a revolutionary fighter for the freedom of the people against the slave ownership of Roman rule. And is a model in that sense for revolutionary struggle right since that time, like the
But now whoever has a money belt is to take it along, likewise also a bag, and whoever has no sword is to sell his coat and buy one. For I tell you, this which is written must be fulfilled of me. And he was numbered with the transgressors, for that which refers to me has to be fulfilled. In other words, Christ is saying, get swords so that the prophecies about me can be fulfilled. And then what do the apostles say? They said, look, Lord, here are 2 swords. Is it conceivable to any of you that with 2 swords Jesus planned to overthrow the Roman Empire?
There were more.
That's what he was trying to suggest, and yet that's what the text shows. It is utter nonsense to the facts. I know he's triggered, and that's why he's interrupting. Ladies and gentlemen, furthermore, this shows that Christ was not a pacifist. Christ went into the temple in John chapter 2, and he cleansed the temple having made a whip of scourges, and he used that whip on man and beast. So Christ was not a pacifist. Christians are not pacifists, but no, they are not communist revolutionaries. I don't blame the communists for trying to claim Jesus. Jesus is the greatest man in history, whose teachings have built civilizations, transformed civilizations, have been the bedrock of societies. It overthrew the Roman Empire. They overthrew the barbarian kingdoms. It resisted the rise of Islam. It survived the birth of the nationalistic governments of the 1700s. It survived the communist states. Why? Because the church was founded by Jesus Christ, and it is only in the church that we can find redemption. And that redemption is transformative of this world, but it is about what happens in the next. The danger of communism, the reason why its ledger is full of the blood of innocent people, is because it has no belief in the next world. The highest authority is the state, and all resources, including all people, should be used for the cause of the ideology. In other words, you are all the means to an end, not an end in yourself. And that is why the ledger of communism is full of blood. But Christianity teaches that every human being is made in the image of God, and therefore is not a means to an end, but must always be treated as an end in themselves. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is another reason why you should abandon communism and follow the way of Christ, follow the teachings of Christ. How am I doing for time?
5 seconds.
I'll stop there, I'll give it to you.
Can I just click that in there? Sure. There we go.
So, as far as I understand it, there's no real evidence that Jesus ever existed. So when we're talking about Jesus Christ as a revolutionary, we're talking about what the specific historical circumstances that led to the emergence of the character, of the belief of this individual as a salvational force. Can someone tell that guy to turn the music off? Because it's not on. As a salvational force to struggle against the existing rule by the slave owners. Come in a wee bit, I can't. So that's one aspect. There is no evidence for the existence of Jesus Christ. Second, but as the character, as a revolutionary, there's evidence. Now, come in a wee bit, come in a wee bit. Come in a wee bit. Come. Now, the argument about the dictatorial rule of communism and so on, well, many regimes that have been established in the name of communism have been dictatorial. And there's a reason for that. It's the same reason why Christianity was never able to fulfill its conceptions, its positive conceptions about how human beings should live collectively and share out the wealth and so on. The reason why that is because the material conditions, if your economy is backward, so let's say our society produces 30 loaves of bread and there's 20 mouths to feed. What is going to happen? It means unless we produce 30 loaves of bread, some people are going to grab the loaves of bread that they require more than other people, and other people will go without. If you produce more, let's say 40 loaves of bread, and there's 30 mouths to feed, and each loaf of bread is an analogy for the necessaries of life, then some people will accumulate that surplus over and above what is produced, because there's not enough for everyone to have an extra loaf of bread, but there is enough for 10 people or less to acquire the surplus produced. How much? 2 minutes. 2 minutes. So if you have some people acquiring that wealth, you have the foundation of class society. And it is class society, the subdivision of human society, into those who own the means to produce the wealth, and therefore that determine the direction a society moves in, that determines how society is organized. And, by the way, what ideas rule in society. Hegel, the Christian, believed that the ideas were a function of the development of the evolution of ideas historically over time. It took place in the brain of man, not in the conditions in which human beings lived. Marx amended Hegel's beliefs by putting them on a material foundation and arguing only when you're able to produce an abundance of wealth would you be able to establish a society based on egalitarian principles where the community is able to collectively develop society democratically without force and, yes, without a state. If you read the Communist Manifesto, you'll know he doesn't worship the state. On the contrary, Marx argued that the state is a product of the backwardness of material development. When you reach a higher level of development, you would be able to replace the state with the democratic, moral and cultural will of the people. Rather than forces of repression, people would use their own culture to regulate human interactions. In fact, at Speaker's Corner, despite my disagreements with Bob, his disagreements with the Muslims and so on, it is very rare for us to fight each other at Speaker's Corner. That is because the culture is developed enough and the material conditions are developed enough for us not to fight each other over every single issue.
So, ladies and gentlemen, you all heard him claim that there's no evidence that Jesus Christ ever existed. Put your hand up if you heard him say that.
You did.
You did hear him say that. However, he doesn't know the history. I'm just going to read from Tacitus.
What time was that? What date?
Nero was right. Tacitus was writing in the 1st century. Nero fastened the guilt on a class hated by their abominations called Christians by the populace. Now notice the brother is triggered and he's shouting at me, wasting my time. Called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of Pontius Pilate. Let me give you another example from Pliny the Younger. Pliny the Younger was writing around 112 AD. They were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang in alternate verses a hymn to Christ. Let me read from you evidence from Josephus Flavius, someone from the 1st century, who wrote, about this time there lived Jesus, a wise man indeed. One ought to call him a man, for he wrote surprising feats. He was Christ. He was the Christ. When Pilate condemned him to be crucified, those who had come to love him did not give up their affections for him. On the 3rd day he appeared, restored life, and the tribe of the Christians has not disappeared. So we have countless first century evidence that Jesus Christ existed. Dr. Bart Ehrman, who is a critic of the Christian faith, has made countless statements affirming his belief in the reality of Jesus as a person. Now, ladies and gentlemen, without the need for revolutions, we Christians hold out for you the society that the communist wants. Read Acts chapter 4 from verse 32 onwards. And the congregation of those who believed were of one heart and soul, and not one of them claimed anything belonging to him was his own, but all things were in common property to them. And with great power the apostles were giving testimony to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and abundant grace was upon them all. For there was not a needy person amongst them, for all who were owners of land or houses would sell them and bring the proceeds of the sales and lay them at the apostles' feet, and they would be distributed each according to the need. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, thousands of years before Karl Marx ever gave his Communist Manifesto, Christ founded a community on theocratic terms that establishes the things that the communists strive for. An example of this would be the Bruderhof today, who I'll talk about more next.
Well, thanks for confirming what I was arguing earlier on. I was arguing earlier on, if you go through the video, you'll be able to see that. I argued earlier on that early Christian communities and Jesus himself advocated some kind of communism, and you just confirmed that. Because what Karl Marx says in the Communist Manifesto is a society would be established, where from each according to their ability, in other words, you work according to your skills and your capability.
Marx believed in God.
He did originally believe in God, yes. He was a Christian. His father was a Lutheran, and he was a Christian up until about his university days.
As a communist?
He wasn't then a communist. He became a communist afterwards. But as you're saying, you said the wealth would be distributed according to need, is because the majority of human history, from our emergence as apes, from the jungles of the Congo and Central Africa, when we emerged as apes from the jungles and entered onto the plains, some kind of ecological change probably precipitated this. And our ancestors adopted upright posture and were able to look around and check for wild beasts and wild animals. We began to have the unique ability to use the counterposed finger and thumb to manipulate nature and make tools, and yes, make idols to explain the occurrences that appear around us. The rising of the sun, which of course doesn't rise, although the church said it rises and the earth is the center of the universe. Galileo and earlier Copernicus proved that this was not the case. Instead of this, the earth moves around the sun. And in Galileo Galilei from Bertolt Brecht, he has the peasants in Palermo dancing on the street and singing. The sun doesn't revolve round the earth. The world doesn't revolve around the princes. In other words, revolutionary conclusions are developed by the scientific and material development that man produces by their control over their hands and their brains. But man is alienated from their basic species essence, from the nature of what human beings are. Human beings are social and collectivist animals, but they are separated from their collectivism precisely by the emergence of a class of people and classes of societies where some people own the wealth produced by the hands and brains of others. And up until today, from the time of the emergence of agricultural society, about 25,000 years BC, human beings have lived under either slavery, feudalism, Asiatic despotism or capitalism, in which a few people own the wealth and the means to produce the wealth. And that can be overthrown, is the argument of Marx.
Exactly.
So, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to move in, if you can't hear my voice, move in, because I'm not going to project my voice. You're not going to keep projecting my voice. The fact of the matter is, ladies and gentlemen, the kind of society that the communists are willing to kill for and die for is the kind of society that Christians have produced. Go and look up the Bruderhof. Go and look them up now. There's a village in England owned not by communists, not created by communists, but created by Christians, in which no one receives a wage, but no one is poor, homeless, or in want. And what is it that underpins that essential village, that utopia that the communists want? Is it the idea of the struggle of the proletariat against the upper echelons of society? No. It is theocracy. It is the idea that in the heart of every one of those believers, those Christians, that Christ is King. And it is because they acknowledge Christ as King that they have been able to establish the thing that the communists want. By contrast, everywhere that the communists have stuck their dagger into society and drawn blood, that experiment has failed because the elites are corrupted by the thing that the communists refuse to accept is there. Sin. The sin of the human heart. The selfishness of the human person. It says in Romans 23, I'll just quote it to you. Romans 23, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Sin is to fall short of what God expects of us. The word sin means to miss the mark. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what we see in our society again and again and again. That man has a telos, he has a direction, a way to live that his soul points to. A life of meaning, a life built on truth, and a life filled with virtue. But communism provides none of these things. Communism is that the ideology is God, and all human persons are to be sacrificed to the altar of the ideology. And that the material world is God, and that we should bow and worship the material world. The moment man worships the creation, he loses himself. Yes, we have been separated from the essence of our being. But that separation is not separation from the means of production. That separation is from God, our Creator. And only when we find ourselves in relationship with God, our Creator, will our values and virtues be so ordered that our lives will be built on truth. Communism has failed. The church is still here. Every communist state has failed, but the church is still here, transforming lives, transforming communities, making man and nature new. Why? Why? Because of the work of God in our lives. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the answer that our society needs, not the writings of Marx.
Yeah. All right. We have covered quite a lot.
Go, Heiko! Tell him!
Okay, so just a little contradiction that would point out. Originally, Bob said that Hegel's ideas don't work because they're part of a trajectory. They believe in some trajectory of direction. A teleology, it's called, which you referred to just now as endemic to your own belief system. So just a little contradiction. And then there's the question about Christianity has done good and communism's done bad. Now, there are many bad things that have been done in the name of communism. I'm not going to dispute that. Probably not as many as he thinks have been done, but many bad things have been done in the name of communism. As many bad things have been done in the name of Christianity and still are done in the name of Christianity. The war in Ukraine is fought in the name of Christianity. The Russians claim to be defending God. The Ukrainians claim to be defending God. The Americans claim to be arming the Ukrainians in defense of the God-driven imperative of their belief system. The British government bombed Iraq, Afghanistan and Libya in the name of God. The Queen of England claims to be, the King of England, behind the times, terribly sorry. But if you look on your coin, it says Elizabeth II, DG, REG, FD. What does it mean? It means the defender of God on earth. That's what it says on every coin. That's the stamp of authority that justifies the acceptance of this coinage as the wealth of the British nation, once the proudest and wealthiest in the world. So all the conquests carried out in the name of Britain were carried out in the name of serving God. So the idea that Christianity is devoid of blood on its hands as an ideology is false. Having said that, I would never dream of blaming Bob or his belief system for those events. Instead of this, I argue that the ideas in which things are fought actually should not be understood through the ideas, but through the material conditions in which people live and which people fight and struggle between different groups in society about who has what, how it's organized, how it's distributed, and how we live. And therefore, what I'm doing is trying to explain how material development and material interactions between real human beings under specific economic and historical circumstances give rise to specific struggles in those societies. The struggles that happen today are different from those of the 13th century, although the language may be the same. When Britain went to war against Africa or against African states, they claimed to be fighting for Christianity. They claimed to be fighting for freedom. They claimed to be defending democracy, but actually they were representing the national capitalist interests of Britain to plunder Africa, to turn the people into slaves, all in the name of God. Freedom is not freedom because the word freedom means something inherently ahistorical. It is specific to the conditions in which the word is used. And therefore, Christianity, and Bob has been indicating this, in contradiction to what I was arguing earlier on, or what he argued earlier on, and in correspondence with what I argued, that basically his aim is to have communistic communities. But I argue those communities you discussed have to have a certain material foundation for them to survive. If you're saying people can live without take what they need, they'll only be able to do that if there's enough for them to get what they need. So one more each.
One more round?
Yeah, one more each.
Okay.
We're doing one more round.
Summation.
Oh, so now the summation is...
Summation? Oh no, one round and summation.
Yeah.
No, now this
This is the summation. Have you had your summation?
You can come back. No.
Okay.
You started.
All right. Right. So, ladies and gentlemen, my final comments, my summation.
All right.
And for those of you that came late, you can find the entire debate on SOCO Films. SOCO Films. Go and look it there. Ladies and gentlemen, I have demonstrated to you that there are great problems with communism and that Christ answers all of those problems. I want to show to you that the reason why our world is in difficulty is not purely because of material conditions. That's the communist thesis. It is because of the brokenness of our own hearts. And it is because this world is subject to principalities and authorities that are not material, they are spiritual, and you can only be free from them when you have knowledge of the truth which is found in Christ. I read from Colossians 1:16. For by him all things were created in heaven and earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created and exist through him and for him. It is only when we find our place in Christ that we find the balance that we need to live our lives in truth and in virtue. If the communist theory is right, then there is no God. If there is no God, then there is no telos, there is no end goal, there is no right and wrong, there is no virtue. The very idea that the communist claims are correct assumes that there is such a thing as truth, and truth does not exist in a world where there is no God. It is, as Richard Dawkins describes, a meaningless universe, indifferent to our existence, cold-hearted, by which we appear by purely random chance. The fact of the matter is, communism contains within it a fundamental contradiction. It hangs upon the scaffold of a theistic worldview whilst denying its own foundations. The reality is, such an inconsistent worldview cannot guide us. But Christ, who said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one goes to the Father but through me," he is the gate by which we can enter into truth. And by knowing that truth, so order our lives with the right values, and to fill our lives with the right virtues that pursue justice, that pursue justice for the poor and the oppressed, which was the refrain of all the prophets of old. And did they do this, as my friend tries to suggest, because they were early communists? No, not at all. They did this because the Spirit of God revealed to them that the ways of God are to have, that righteousness should flow like a river, that every man should find his dignity, and that dignity is not provided to him simply by his material possessions, but by the fact that he is created by God, that he knows God, and that in that knowing of God he should truly know himself and truly know his neighbour, loving his neighbour as himself.
Last time.
Hola, Bobsila! Wait, Heiko. Go, Higgs!
Okay, so we have, I think, during the course of this discussion, revealed a number of the fundamental differences between Marxist theory and religious theory, particularly the Christian theory that Bob here advocates. And so I'm grateful. Bob's asked me many times to do this discussion, and I'm grateful that we've had the chance to do this. I think it is a better discussion than that discussion that was famous on the internet, the Jordan Peterson Slavoj Žižek discussion, where neither of them knew what they were talking about. At least Bob seems to know what he's talking about in relation to Christianity. I'm not saying Jordan Peterson doesn't, but Jordan Peterson knew nothing about what he was talking about in relation to communism. Slavoj Žižek didn't seem to know anything about anything he was talking about, as is his modus operandi. So, but he is a funny guy, that's perfectly true. You get the impression he takes a bit of coke when he's constantly playing with his nose like that. But in any case, I'm not to condemn that. So, what is the crux of the issue that we're discussing here? As far as I can see, it seems to be a belief within Marxism that the way in which human beings make wealth, the way in which we intercommunicate, has changed over history and is altered based on how the surplus that is produced in society is organized and what technologies are used to produce wealth. That is not about material possessions and individual wealth per se. It's about a way of organizing human life. And there's no doubt that human life today is fundamentally different to human life in Judea 100 years AD. By the way, all the people you cited for references for the existence of Jesus died or wrote. The earliest was 30 years after Jesus was supposed to have died. Now, I know a lot of people who can barely remember the dictatorial regime established last year, the year before, and the year before that. So if that's the case, how do people think back over what happened 30 years ago? And they write those things down in something that you take to be a holy text. But those holy texts were amended by a committee of Romans about 200 years AD. So the idea that we have the exact wording of what happened at that time is a farcical nonsense. Nobody can subscribe to that seriously. So we have to ask ourselves, what are these messages that exist in history and documents? What do we find out from archaeology, from the history of religion, from anthropology, from the history of society? We discover the way in which human beings produce, the way in which ideas develop, are connected together. And science is the discovery, real science, the discovery, the encroachment, not to absolute truth, the approximation of truth. We investigate, we analyse, we try to refute, we discover what is and isn't working. And we accept that even when we make such a hypothesis and declare it to be true, like 1 and 1 is 2, even such fundamental axioms of our thought are not actually correct. 1 is based on a thumb. 1 is based on a thumb. Our numerical system is based on our fingers. Why do we count in tens? Because we got 10 fingers and thumbs. And therefore we count like this. But this thumb is not the same as that thumb. No human being is the same as another human being. And no human being is the same as they were at the second they said they're a human being. Heiko is Heiko and he's not Heiko. Because he changes all the time, as everybody changes. Everything is in a constant process of flux and transformation. And in that transformation, we have advanced towards new and superior types of society. Thank you very much.
How about we do questions from the audience? Questions from the audience.
Okay.
So, ladies and
But
gentlemen,
let's make it 5 minutes for that, yeah?
ladies and gentlemen, each one of us now are going to take a question from one of you. So I'm now going to take one question, and when I've answered that, Heiko's going to come up and take a question. So have you got any questions, ladies and gentlemen, on what I've said?
I think that's a bit naff.
Communist countries have failed. Well, you got China, you got Vietnam. How do you explain them and their communist countries?
So, ladies and gentlemen,
What was the question, Bob Sila?
part of my thesis as to why you should follow Christianity and not communism is because communism failed. And the brother has offered up China as a successful state. Do you honestly believe that China is a successful state?
China and Vietnam.
China, when properly understood, is a national socialist ideology. It is, in other words, a Nazi state, not a communist state. It favours the Chinese ethnically over all other peoples, and it even persecutes other ethnic minorities inside the boundaries of China. China is a state that economically has abandoned communism and embraced capitalism. It's more of a capitalist society than a communist society. It is an authoritarian capitalist system. Therefore, it is an example of the failure of communism. And very quickly, let's be clear. What I define as failure, defining as failure as a Christian, is when you don't live your life in accordance with the truth and you don't fill your life with virtue. And China has no concern for either, because the Communist Party doesn't believe that either exists.
Yeah, but you have 800 people coming out of poverty.
No, let him take a question.
I'll reply to this.
Okay, and then you take a question and I'll...
Okay, Heiko will
I prefer we don't do too much more though, because Piers won't come up here and speak. So
You take a question and
one more, yeah.
you reply to mine, take a question.
Okay, I the same question, I think, because the question's addressed to both of us actually, isn't it? So, is China communist? It is and it is not. The same as I pointed out earlier on. There are elements of China that are communistic. You mentioned things like sharing out wealth. Well, public sector economy in China is the biggest or the dominant sector of the economy. So they provide housing, some healthcare, They provide provision in the urban areas for people at a level that is far higher than a comparative country, for example, India. In India, or a comparative continent, Africa, where the living conditions are far worse than the living conditions of the masses in China. China doesn't maintain, or Communist Party isn't in power in China because they ruthlessly suppress people, or certainly not exclusively because of that. It's in power because it has consistently, over decades, raised the living standards, the opportunities, the hopes and the dreams of the mass of the people of China. No regime can survive. That's the point. You could have a Christian regime in China. In fact, you did have leaders in China who claimed to be Christian. You even had a Christian revolution in China, in the Taiping Rebellion, in which 50 million people died, by the way. 50 million people, but he wasn't really a Christian. So the question is China communistic? There are elements of communism and there are elements of capitalism. The elements of capitalism are repression, exploitation, child labour and so on. And the clash in China is between these forces. I believe that Marx was correct, that the working class are the agents of revolutionary change. And that would be valid for the working class of China as well. I believe the working class of China, their aspirations, their demands are what shape the trajectory of Chinese society. And by the way, I can prove this in relation to this. For 2.5 years, we protested in Hyde Park and throughout the Western world against the, against the lockdowns. But, I'll finish in 1 second, against the lockdowns. But in China, when the protests broke out in November last year, it took 3 weeks for all the lockdown measures to be removed after a few relatively small protests. In other words, the government in China, like it or not, is compelled to respond rapidly to the demands of the masses when they emerge.
Okay, now take a question. Who's going to take a question?
Oh,
now?
and then we'll finish it, yeah?
Right.
And then we'll finish it.
So, Heiko, any questions for Heiko?
Question if you want. No questions.
Any questions?
C'est la vie.
Right, then.
No, that's fine. You can make your final pitch and then we'll finish, yeah? Okay, you make your final pitch and then we finish. Is that all right, yeah?
All right.
You get the last word.
Thank you,
and then along comes our Christian speaker over here. The hero.
So, ladies and gentlemen, you all heard the high praise of Heiko for one of the most oppressive, destructive and violent regimes in the world today. Let me tell you about what is happening to Christians in China. This communist society is trying, as we speak, to stamp out the church. It has said to Christians that they cannot display their crosses in public. It has said to them that they cannot gather in their own societies that are not governed by a state church. Something that we Christians reject as a point of principle, as a matter of doctrine, that we should give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar and to God what belongs to God. And in reply to this defiance of the church, Christians are being arrested. Christians are being used to harvest organs inside the prison system. Christians are being enslaved in concentration camps inside of China. This communist regime is an enemy of the church, and every Christian should work for its destruction, and every Christian should work against it and against its supporters, including the lovely Heiko here. Ladies and gentlemen, we Christians will not ever accept an authority above God. The communists say that the state and the party is the highest authority. That is a worldly idol that is worshipped by men, because since the 1700s, men have worshipped their own creations in the nation state. in their political ideologies, their institutions, like socialists worship the NHS, and like right-wing people worship the British Army. Christians reject all idolatry. We worship only God, and that is why Christians are being persecuted in China. So when you hear the high praises of China, just remember at the end of those high praises are Christians starving and dying in prisons, separated from those that they love, only because they claim Christ as their Lord, and because that is an offence in a communist state. And everywhere where communism has been tried, the church has been persecuted. Oppose communism if you are a soldier of Christ. I just want to end by saying thank you, Heiko. That was really lovely. God bless you.
We love you, Heiko.
Yeah. You take. I'd like to give you a gift.
He's going to give me a Bible.
No, not a Bible. I'm sure you've got a Bible. I'm sure you've got a Bible.
I have. You know where I got a Bible from? When I was arrested, they gave me one at the police station.
Really? Seriously?
The only book they had, apart from Thomas Clancy or whatever his name is, you know. So that okay, I'll take the Bible.
Okay, Heiko. I'd like to give you a gift then.
Go on then, quick. Roses.
Yeah, we got more to come.
Yeah.
God Pierce, God Pierce.
There you go.
You're gonna need
Can man live without
I've got a
God?
proper booklet. I sent it on eBay. Thanks very much.
Have a read of it first. You look after yourself. If there are any questions, I'll be over there.